So thank you all for coming. My name is Beth Allen. I'm the Deputy Director and Curator here at Morven, and I'm up here to introduce Steve Petrucelli. So back in the early spring of 2020, I went to see an exhibit at Ellerslie Museum in Trenton, and there was a beautiful tall case clock on view, Trenton-made clock by John Conover. And I, in passing, said to the person taking me through, oh, I always thought a show on New Jersey tall case clocks would be a really neat idea. And the guy said, oh, well, if you ever do, I know who you should talk to. And I said, who? And he said, Steve Petrucelli. And I said, oh, can you connect me? And he said, actually, he's giving a talk next week. But next week was March 15th, 2020. So that lecture did not happen. But I was able to get Steve's phone number, and we talked through quarantine. And I said, this is the idea. Do you think it's crazy? And he said, well, it's a little crazy, but you could definitely do it. And I said, would you help me do it? And he said, yes. And so if you haven't seen the exhibit yet, we're open till 4 today. So I hope you will scoot over there either during question and answer or right after. And of course, you're welcome to come back any other time. But that show is truly a labor of love from Steve. And we are so grateful to have had him help us along the way. 52 clocks is no small feat. Steve helped us get them here, clean them, assemble them, photograph them inside and out. And so we've just learned so much. So you're gonna learn a lot today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Steve.
So welcome everyone and people virtually watching the show on Zoom. And just a quick aside, I just thought I would let you know that when we started this program almost 2 years ago, Joe Falcone had the original planning meeting, and he set up an appointment to go to Salem County Historical Society. That's where we started. And the William Crow clock in the exhibit is from Salem County, and down the street were 2 old friends of mine. Maybe if you've been collecting and been around long enough, you know Ron and Diane Walrath. So we spent the day with them, and they had a house full of New Jersey clocks, and 2 of their clocks are in this exhibit. We're very fortunate to their daughter, Trish McCormick, for loaning them. But unfortunately, they're not here because last fall, they both, within a week or 2, passed from sickness and surgical complications from surgery. So the catalog, which I wrote and published and will be available in about a week, I dedicate the catalog to Ron and Diane, who are not here. So we'll start with an overview that basically there are 2 craft centers in New Jersey and more or less mapping the centers of population, East and West Jersey. So I'm going to cover clocks over a 100-year period, tall case clocks with brass dials. On the top, they're from East Jersey, northern clocks. On the bottom row are clocks from the Delaware Valley, Trenton down to Salem, from the early brass dial period through the painted dial period. And we'll go through the federal period clocks and show the characteristics. So you'll be able to tell a South Jersey from a North Jersey clock just by looking at it from 20 feet away. And these population centers more or less map the activity around the Delaware River bordered on the west, the ocean, Hudson River, and the inlets, Raritan River into New Brunswick on the right. These are your craft centers in Burlington County and in Union County. So we'll start with this in a way that's geographically and chronologically oriented as well. So I'm going to start in South Jersey with the early clocks. We'll go through the brass dial clocks in South Jersey, then North Jersey, and then we'll go to the painted dial clocks. But in the middle of this period of the Queen Anne through the Chippendale clocks, so your Queen Anne clocks are in the center, your Chippendale clocks flank it on the right and left. Something comes along, and it's called the Revolutionary War, which is right in the middle of this period, and it had a major impact on life in colonial New Jersey. And New Jersey had no small number of skirmishes. These are the hundreds of skirmishes, this list. And the red, if you can imagine, which so much for that, these red dots are where the highest activity with battles took place, and where you're sitting right now, you're not far from one of the major battles in the Revolutionary War. So all this activity had to take place while they're trying to make a living, farm, do navigation, build clocks, and in their spare time, fight the British. So the story starts in the city of Burlington, and you might take this for granted, but the city of Burlington predates Philadelphia by 5 years. It's actually one of the earliest colonial settlements. There's clocks being made in Burlington County at this time, first quarter of the 18th century. This is one of the earliest clocks. You can tell it's an early clock just by looking at the dial. This is a very heavy composite dial with applied spandrels, applied chapter ring. If you notice these ring collars around the winding arbors, this tells you you're looking at early 18th, possibly even late 17th century. But we don't have any evidence of late 17th century clocks in New Jersey. This would be early first quarter, 18th century. The square dial is first. And the square dial cases are typically flat top. This has a caddy on the top with fretwork and ball and spire finials. Very simple rectilinear lines. And these clock cases are made using local native hardwoods, walnut, cherry, and maple. The secondary wood construction is typically yellow pine and cedar. This one has a cedar backboard in it. The last thing about the dial you notice is these fleur-de-lis and these engravings mid-hour. So what's that for? This is a carryover when clocks only had one hand. The earliest clocks didn't have a minute hand. They only had an hour hand. You could tell time within 15 minutes with this extra graduation or division. This is a extremely early and important Isaac Pearson clock. His name is engraved in the edge of the chapter ring. You can see Isaac Pearson, Burlington. And this is a clock made in an English manner. This is an English Quaker clockmaker building count wheel strike mechanisms, very similar to what's taking place on the other side of the ocean, although not the fine finishing. You can see the rough casting, you can see the finished plates. If this clock was made in London, they would have been thrown out of the guild, basically because of the level of perfection and the finishing. But nonetheless, it's an early clock with this was called the count wheel. This is an auxiliary ring that's mounted to the back of the winding drum on the left side. So you're going to wind the left for the strike mechanism, wind the right for the time. And the distance between these notches dictates how many times the bell strikes. So the time for 1 o'clock, you have very close channels. The time for 12 o'clock, very broad length. You can see they're narrower here and broader here as it rotates in time. This gear here, this is motion work to drive the calendar. This steel piece is the way that the strike mechanism is initiated. The way the strike mechanism is terminated is a lever comes down and catches in the notch, drops, and then the fly stops and the clock stops striking. This is a clock that's in the exhibit. This is also an early clock. This is probably second quarter of the 18th century. Why? Because now the dials have grown an arch. Now, it's a two-piece dial, the carryover. The dial itself is a square dial that was part of the original fabrication. And then to add this arch section is a pin second section. So this is a walnut Delaware Valley case. You see this one has instead a little small refinement of a tombstone-shaped door. You see this. So clocks evolve. They're getting more refined. And they're getting different proportions now because adding this arch lifts the bonnet up. The movement's very similar, only this one has arch cutouts in the plates. So economical use. This structure, sure you've driven over thousands of bridges in your life. This arch provides the structural integrity that you need for the strength of the movement, along with these corner pillar posts. This forms the frame of the movement. And so structurally, this has equal strength to a solid plate movement. So they had that knowledge and they had that understanding in the 18th century. This one also shows you how these dials are built up from a dial blank. So you have your basic brass dial blank, and then you see these notches, this to pull out of the casting. So these dial blanks, they're not solid because they knew that over the top of this would be another piece of brass where the engraving of the ring and the numbers would be. On the left here, this shows you the strike mechanism. Again, here's your count wheel, and this is the motion work to drive the calendar. So you're looking at about 1730, this clock right here. So these are family businesses. They all start out as one particular maker, school, and apprentices build up, and a good way to get into family business is marry the leader's daughter. So Joseph Hollinshead Sr. marries Sarah Pearson. Pearson and Hollinshead, they start selling clocks probably towards the end of the second quarter of the 18th century. And you can see that this particular clock has not only this arch section of the dial, it's also a two-piece dial, by the way. This is in gallery 1. But it also has this step top with so-called caddy or sarcophagus top with fret. So this really has become a statuesque piece. It's a very fine piece of furniture now. This is a cherry case made with local Delaware Valley hardwoods, and this one has a yellow pine. Now, one thing, yellow pine backboard. Now, one thing that came out of this clock is the fact that when we were going through and cataloging, we opened the door, and Beth and I were looking at each other, and it can't be. There's a paper repair label in here from the early 1800s by Peter Hill, Burlington, and it was hidden by this like 1960s piece of cardboard that somebody had thumbtacked to the backboard. Now, the other thing that you see here on this movement, this is a totally different movement. So the count wheel suffers from the point of having the synchronization problem between the hour hand and the number of strikes on the bell. To solve that problem, they developed this, what's called a rack and snail striking system. So you've added a lot of parts now. Just having that simple count wheel with notches in it now has been replaced by this cam, and you can see the depth of the cam as it grows. So this would be 12 o'clock, right, deepest, and all the way over here to the shallowest, that's 1 o'clock. What happens is this rack falls and hits against the edge of this cam. And this is called the snail. This is called the gathering pallet. This spins. This is the snail that retains the position of the rack. And so as this clock strikes, it counts these number of teeth, bottoms out when it hits the end. This post right here is terminates the rotation of this. This is called a gathering pallet with a tail on it. So this is what's coming by the mid-18th century. Now, there's always been this hypothesis that these clocks really were initiated by this particular maker called Anthony Ward. Anthony Ward is working in Freehold at some point in his life. He's also working in New York and Philadelphia. I've never seen an Anthony Ward clock that was signed in New Jersey. I've had several that say New York. We've had several that say nothing. This is a missing piece, but as the pendulum would bob, there would be a false pendulum here that would bob. This is a case, a Philadelphia case from the shop of John Head. This is a maple case from New York, and these are the dials, and neither one of them says New Jersey. So the connection with Anthony Ward and New Jersey Clockmakers is still unresolved at this point. So in Salem, we have all the way down at the tip of New Jersey, as you might imagine, we have a family that's also working in Wilmington. So William Crow is the brother of George Crow. They are both apprenticed in Philadelphia in the shop of Peter Stretch. This is a walnut case, and the reason to show a second shot is to show the art. These arch side moldings are typical of what you find in Philadelphia, 18th century Philadelphia. And obviously this cabinet maker could have been sourcing this case in Philadelphia. It could have been locally made, but it has all the characteristics of what you'd find in Philadelphia. First thing, you see these mitered, the front styles of this clock with these miters. These miters and tombstone door, typical Delaware Valley. You see the columns on the door of the bonnet, they're integral. They're not freestanding columns. This dentil molding and these arch that conform with the arches and the side lights, very, very typical of Philadelphia. It's William Crow, Salem. And to show you, to solidify the attribution and the fact that Crow apprenticed in Philadelphia with Stretch, look at these two movements. This is a Peter Stretch movement, early 18th century. Look at the way the bell stands mount on the front plate. Look at the shape of the strike levers. Look at the layout of the gears. And it's not hard to see that this particular apprentice, William Crow, was taught in Philadelphia by Peter Stretch. So this is a clock from Monmouth County Historical Society. It's well known. It's in Droth's book. It's been in the museum since the 1930s. This is probably one of the earliest Hollinshead clocks made by himself on his own without Isaac Pearson. It has all the look of Delaware Valley Queen Anne furniture, and it's not that one, it's this one. And you can see here that this also has a count wheel strike mechanism. What's missing, you can see this post here. This is an idle post. This post here would have the motion work that is here and here. That's to drive the calendar. But if you've owned clocks, you know that indexing moons, indexing calendars, these are things that stop clocks. There's always a lot of friction, there's binding, there's mechanical interference. The oil on these pivots, they dry out. And so what a lot of people over the years do, instead of correcting the problem, solving the problem, they dissect the problem and remove parts. The other thing you can see here is the color now. You're starting to see some things here that are very indigenous to New Jersey craftsmanship, very high copper content in the brass that's used. This is another Holland's head clock. This shows you the added, as you've added this arch section to the top of the dial, now there's real estate up here to do other things. So you could have just a name boss. This one has a moon dial. This is Joseph Holland's head Sr., very similar case in construction to the Monmouth County clock. This one's not here. They wouldn't let me bring it, but that's okay. You can still see, this is one of the earliest moon dials that you'd find in one of these. Look at the herringbone engraving. And the hemispheres now have this elaborate scroll work. Moon and the stars is what you see. These are tiny little moons. And the reason why they're tiny little moons is that they had to fit between the dial posts that hold this dial to the front plate of the movement. You can see here's the moon wheel on this Holland's head clock. Notice it has to fit inside. Now, some of the Philadelphia clocks and a lot of the English clocks, they have these ears on the front plate. You'll see these extensions, broad extensions, so that the top posts can accommodate a much larger moon wheel. But the early clocks use very tiny moons, and that's how you know you can date this to around 1750. This is a clock from South Jersey. This is Jacob Holland's head. Now, Jacob Holland's head doesn't come through the same line as Joseph Holland's head or Joseph Jr. or Hugh Holland's head. Jacob Holland's head is the son of John Jr.'s rather than Joseph. So basically, Joseph Holland's head's grandfather, his brother, is the father of Jacob Holland's head. So there's like 20 Holland's head clockmakers. I mean, I get confused myself going through them, but they're all family related, distant cousins. So you could say Jacob Holland's head is a distant cousin to Joseph Holland's head. And this is a clock made about the same time. The thing about this clock, which is so interesting, is that you see it's got the collared winding arbors, the fleur-de-lis, half-hour markers, and all the early characteristics. What's also interesting is this is a transitional striking mechanism. This clock was originally designed to be a count wheel strike train. It has drill and pins in the great wheel on the strike side, but it's actually a rack and snail. So this is a clock somewhere between 1740 and 1750. If we come up the river into Bordentown, we find this Samuel Short's clock. This is a well-known clock. It belonged to Alphonse Legendre many years as an old friend. This has a couple of complications that are noteworthy. The first complication is you see this little slot with this lever. This has a strike silent operation. So at night, if you don't want to hear the clock chiming, you can turn it off. It also has this subsidiary dial, 1 through 7. These are the days of the week. So you have the calendar day of the month and you have the day of the week in this complication. So this is a walnut Queen Anne clock from Bordentown. I'm sure the Short's name means a lot, especially if you collect decoys in New Jersey, but this is Samuel Short's Bordentown. And this is a clock, I first saw this, no, that's not me, but I first saw this, it was in the Bordentown library years ago. Al had this on loan while he owned it and shared it with people. But this is a clock that's well known in this area. And this is the movement. One thing you see for sure, if you recognize, you look at the strike lift arm, it's in the center, and there's a post in the center, and it's spring-loaded. This flat steel piece here, this is actually a spring, so that strike silent lever pushes against this post. And basically what you're doing is you're either allowing this lever to be activated by this pin, or you're having this pin miss this lever. So that's your strike silent. Benjamin Reeve, Greenwich, all the way down at the bottom of New Jersey, the clocks were being made. And this is a very bold Chippendale clock. This would be third quarter, 18th century. You can see the embellishments in the case and the architectural features. Now you see the turtle, this OG bracket feet, they're a little low. The photo didn't cut them off. They're actually a little low, which is very common, but they are the original feet. This is a turtle base, tombstone door, and you see these elaborately carved rosettes with bold urn and flame tip finials. So you're into the Chippendale period. It's a little bit later than the other clocks. The first thing you notice in the bonnet is you have detached columns. So the columns separate from the door after 1750. This is a combination of a couple of things. One of them is not so good. So the first thing that happens when people clean clocks, especially people that don't know what they're doing, and they use an aqueous ammonious solution, it pulls the zinc out of the plates and it highlights the copper. That coupled with a high copper content, so you get all of this discoloration. So you have your clock cleaned by a clock repairman. Make sure they use a non-aqueous cleaning solution. This is Jacob Hollinshead, Salem. A little bit later than the first one. This is a true rack and snail strike mechanism. And this one also suffers from the fate of having these holes here. They're not air holes. They had a post, and the post got removed, and another post added. That was to drive the calendar, which is no longer here. Still a wonderful piece of furniture, one of the nicest pieces of furniture you'll find in Delaware Valley. Very bold carved scrolls. These have inset carved rosettes. And by the way, these rosettes and finials are original. This is the Colonel Samuel Dick clock, 1776, came out of the Meekum estate, and it's a well-known clock in this area. Now, coming up a little bit into Mount Holly, these are Chippendale clocks. This is Isaac, not John Wood, this is Isaac Wood and William Hudson. They are making brass style Chippendale clocks. These clocks are from the third quarter of the 18th century. You can see the proportions, these cases, nearly identical. The other thing about this, when you see that this is a true applied panel, if you remove this panel, either one of these panels, it's a hollow behind that, right? So this is not a panel over a flat base. So they basically knew that, and that's one of the reasons why they're separated here, because there's nothing to hold it behind. So you can see the shaped waist door, you can see the corners in this applied panel, floral rosettes, and both are moon lunar phase dials, Wood and Hudson, Mount Holly. Cabinet maker here is Joseph Brumley, is the cabinet maker that made these cases. Now, the Hudson and Wood Hudson movements are very identifiable. And the movement made by Peter Hill has the same characteristic. And this is adapted from a German, it's called a strike rack lock. So these use a gathering pallet that does not have a tail. Here's the gathering pallet. After the rack indexes to its final position, it drops and locks. This is called strike rack locking. This is something you find in South Jersey. You're not going to see this in Elizabethtown or New Brunswick. Very identifiable feature, the Delaware Valley, especially Burlington County. So with the two brothers, they're in business in the Chippendale period, just after the Revolutionary War in that time period. This is Joseph and John Jr. This one is not in the exhibit, but there's one very similar to it from Burlington County Historical Society. Again, the case should be very familiar to you by now, these very bold carved scrolls with floral carved rosettes. In the center of these rosettes, you'll see very detailed simulation of the pistil of a flower. Shaped waist door, shaped base panel, arch plates, countwheel strike, rack and snail strike mechanism. So in summary, in Hudson's work, from the finest, most formal example, which is this one, this is the well-known clock that everyone has seen. This was owned by the Pricketts and Howard Smokell. Before that, it's got the fretwork, the lattice fretwork between the scrolls that you find in the formal Philadelphia clocks with the relief vine carving. Of course, this is the New Jersey country interpretation of the high-style Philadelphia form. These two, you can obviously are very closely related. This is an illusion base. So this is a solid base panel, and this is just a molding. So from a distance, you think that this is a panel over the base. It's not. It's just a molding that provides the illusion of a base panel. And 20 years later, into the painted dial Chippendale period, you can see how the styles have more or less retained. only this one has a much bolder arch, much more elaborate carving. The case on this is nearly identical to the clock in the Mabel Bravey Garden collection at Yale University. If you have that book, you can see it and look it up. And this shows you what a dial would have looked like the day it was made. It would have been silvered and to protect against passivation and oxidation. And this one at one time was silvering, but the silver is all gone. The Hudson clocks typically were three-handed clocks. And the third hand is for the calendar, this internal engraving on the inner part of the time track. These are the days of the month. This one has the calendar hand. This one doesn't. And the other thing you see is the lunar day date itself is on the wheel itself with a pointer. And this one, the lunar date is engraved on the outside part. And just so when you evaluate these things, you can't take a parochial attitude that the signature has to be this or it has to be this form. No, it doesn't. It has to be right. It has to be original. There's a lot of different journeymen working and passing through these shops and apprentices, and they're traveling for a short period of time, passing through a particular shop. So depending on who engraved it, it could be Will with an M Hudson, Mount Holly. This just Will M Hudson. The engraving on this is Phil William Hudson. This is on the back of one of the waste doors, W Hudson. So there's a lot of different forms, and don't fix your mind into having a very rigid opinion as to what something looks like. This is Joseph Hollinshead Jr. He's the one who trained Peter Hill. This is a transitional Chippendale case. This one uses also a silver dial. And you're looking at the last quarter of the 18th century. So this is Joseph Hollinshead Jr. And this is the movement. It's a pretty generic 8-day brass striking movement. There's no false plate. The dial mounts directly to the front of the movement. And this is Isaac Pearson's grandson. So this is a clock with a lot of different characteristics and styles. The dial on this thing looks like it's 1750, 1760. The case is starting to look around 1800, especially with these cut corners in the door. And there's no base, no treatment or a turtle on the base. But it still has carved rosettes and bull and spire finials. If you look at this clock is in Gallery 1, and if you make a mental note of what this looks like and then go into Gallery 3 and look at the John Conover case from Trenton, you will see the connection between Burlington and Trenton, and actually Isaac Pearson Rodman at one point in time had a shop, and their clocks signed Isaac Pearson Rodman Trenton as well. As far as the movement, it's a typical locally made movement. This is not an English movement. And the way you can tell this is the way these plates are finished. These are sand casted plates that have not had a lot of secondary operation or polishing. And you can also see how the parts itself have gotten much smaller, less robust, not as finely finished. So over time, they're trying to reduce cost, as you can see. What else is new? Now we have to get in a car and drive about 75 miles north, and we'll go up to Union County and Elizabethtown and turn the hands of time back into the early 18th century, so we can look at Aaron Miller. This is an engraved silver plate that was discovered on the back of a waste door of a clock, and this is Aaron Miller's advertisement in the New York Weekly. And the interesting thing here, and this ties in something that we take for granted too. We look at this thing, we're talking about clocks, but you know what? One of the primary aspects of their fabrication was making things for land, surveying, transits, compasses. You go back and look at the old deeds. They're measuring in rods and chains. So this point here about compasses, chains for surveyors, extremely important. I've never seen any of this by Aaron Miller. I've been collecting for 50 years. But the registrar here, Jessie Gordon, she found the compass, Aaron Miller compass, that's in Gallery 4. You need to see this. Maybe the only one that survived in the original case. But this is the original advertisement. This is a same paper, but this different date, 1747. So a lot of northern New Jersey furniture has been made to look like something that it's not. So one of the woods that cabinet makers used, and you'll find this on cupboards, on case furniture, desks, linen press, cause, is gumwood, red gum. Gum is a very clear material. It doesn't take a stain, doesn't have a complex grain structure or pore density, but it's easy to paint. A lot of the early clocks, and this is one of them, this is a faux grain decorated gum case to look like it's mahogany. It's poor man's mahogany. On the other hand, you refinish this and it's going to look like a piece of clear pine. A lot of the furniture you see that's been refinished that looks this way originally was painted. Very, very hard to find original New Jersey furniture that has this original finish. This one has the oculus in the door. Look, this is an early clock, very finely. Remember the way the Pearson was engraved in the chapter ring? These are your early clocks. It's got the half-hour fleur-de-lis. This one also has the collared winding arbors, so you can tell how early the clock is by looking at these rings around the winding arbors. This one also has a tiny moon with the penny moon and the lunar date up in the arch. Very nice, very early clock, very original clock. And an amazing experiment inside. There's a lot of unnecessary gears in here. Every time you have a gear, you reverse the direction of something, right? So this, this particular movement, and maybe it was just having fun, or maybe this was just a prototype or a training thing for someone. This is just a transmission gear. It serves no function. It just couples two gears that are coupled together anyway. This is the drive for the moon. This is the drive for the calendar. And it's all geared off this, what's called the hour cannon. This has the count wheel strike with a flat brass lift. Here is the wood drums. These are apple or cherry. These are turned wooden drums, something you don't find in South Jersey. Count wheel strike train with wooden winding drums. And it's amazing so many of these remain without being cracked or broken. Now you have to be very careful because a lot of times when you get these clocks restored by people, they put metal cables on, steel or brass cables. You don't ever want to put metal cables on a wood wire. If you have a Miller or Brokaw clock, never put steel or brass cables. So this is one of the earliest Aaron Miller clocks. It's one that I was fortunate, it's not in the exhibit, I own it. I was fortunate to get it back. This is the first New Jersey clock I ever bought. And I had no idea what this is called beginner's luck. This is back in late 60s, I was in high school, I bought a clock at a local auction. And this is it. It turned out to be an exceptionally good clock. But long story short, what's interesting here is to show the different engraving. This gets back to journeyman, apprentices, etc. The different engraving of the name, and I'll show you a couple of different scenarios for Aaron Miller. But what this clock does have, if we can stay on the slide, is a wonderful example, prototypical Aaron Miller, but the most incredible thing is the bell. The bell on this clock after it strikes will still have a resonance minutes after you go back. Now I've done this, I'm an electrical engineer and I know something about Fourier analysis and I've looked at this and digitized this. The reason for this is that this particular bell has a resonance with a harmonic content that is unlike many other bells that you'll find. It has to do with the size, the geometry, and the metal composition. And if you notice that one of the things in his advertisement, he makes church bells. So making bells was something that he was extremely gifted at, and he had the knowledge of the physics without designing anything, without solving a single equation, maybe just by trial and error. He had the knowledge how to make bells that have an unbelievable tonal quality that you won't find. You could have a room with 20 clocks in that all strike at the same time. You'll hear this one and not the other 19. So this one here has this flat brass lifting arm, count wheel strike, wooden winding drums. This one still has the motion work to drive the calendar. And unfortunately, I didn't do this, but unfortunately in the life of the clock, you see all this chatter mark. These are people trying to, instead of drilling this out and putting bushings in place, they tried to punch to close the holes because these things do wear out. 300 years later, it's still keeping time. Now, just to dispel the Anthony Ward story one more time, again, the hypothesis that Aaron Miller is trained by Anthony Ward, I don't see it. This is Anthony Ward. The shape of the arch plates, totally different. One of the construction structural concepts that Miller had was using tapered steel pillar plates, a pillar post to hold the plates together, not these turn plates. You can see that Miller wanted the flat brass strike lift and not the steel. This is more like the English style. So, I mean, you think this guy learned from this guy? I don't. So this is another form of the engraving. If you remember the loop inside the M, this is what you find on a lot of Cornelius Miller. I think by the time that we get past the mid-18th century, I don't know how much Aaron Miller is making on his own or he's supervising a shop with journeyman clockmakers and apprentices. This is in the Gallery 4. This is a 3-train musical. One of the things about New Jersey musical clocks, especially the early ones, this is not true about the later painted dial musicals, but the brass dial musicals have an extremely compact design. And the reason this is done is to keep the thickness of the case and the proportions of the case intact, and also to have a pin barrel or a drum. These hammers are all activated by pins on a drum. It's a wooden drum with a brass shell, and as it rotates, it selects different hammers. And why are there more hammers than the bells? That's how you play eighth notes. So the timing is such, if you needed to double strike a bell, you needed another hammer to touch that bell. Count wheel strike train, arch plates. You see this tapered steel pillar post. This is a wonderful machine. You know, you're looking at something from 1750, 1745, and they have this complexity. And Miller's known for his giant speed-reducing device with this flat brass propeller that hangs out the back of the plate. There's not many that have survived like this. A lot of these clocks, the strike trains were ripped out because they stopped the clock, and rather than try to repair it or restore it, they removed it. This is a cherry case. Cornelius Miller is Aaron Miller's son. Ironically or sadly, he dies in 1779, the same year as his father, but it's made in the same manner, the same type of case, cherry case, sarcophagus top, ball finials, silver brass dial. This is what happens when you don't take care of it. If you have a silver brass dial, if you have a tall case clock with a silver brass dial, every few years you should clean it with a mild soap and then use a microcrystalline wax. Renaissance, and I learned that, and I'm looking at a friend of mine in the audience who showed me that about 5 years ago. You need to clean it and wax it and preserve the surface and seal with microcrystalline wax. So this is a second generation Miller. This is Cornelius Miller, but the second generation Aaron Miller clocks are the same as well. But they still retain the characteristics with the wood winding drums, the tapered steel plates, cutouts, arch plates. This is all Elizabeth. This is all 18th century, and this is third quarter of the 18th century. This is the Cornelius Miller case. Couple things you notice right away. It's a later brass dial. You don't see the collared winding arbors. You don't see the fleur-de-lis in the chapter ring. And this is a cherry case. You still see the columns in the bonnet, part of the door. And this is the movement from the side. And you can see these tapered, very, very identifiable feature for Elizabethtown, these tapered steel pillar posts to retain the structural integrity of the movement. This is your wood winding drum. And one of the other things, characteristics of Miller's, is the bell hammer is mounted on the center of this arbor and not toward the back, okay, or the front. Anthony Ward's bells strike from the back. A little bit of an interesting, obviously inspired by the Millers, but a different movement. This one is possibly unique for the time. It sweeps second hand. So this is a clock with a second hand, but it's a center sweep movement. Rare in New Jersey. Not a lot of New Jersey tall case clocks have sweep second hands. This does. And this one has the calendar. Same big ring. There's a big giant calendar wheel with gears. And now the opening for the calendar is up at the top of the dial rather than the bottom of the dial. But the sweep hand is the main thing. Obviously, this case is very closely related to the Cornelius Miller that we saw in the previous slide. This is Stephen Tishner, Newark, New Jersey. And you're looking at the third quarter of 18th century here. The Tishner movements have a lot in common with the Miller movements. Clearly, he's working in the shop, learning from Cornelius or Aaron Miller, tapered steel pillar plates, wood winding drum, count wheel strike train. This is your brass, flat brass strike lift. But now this auxiliary motion work to drive the calendar, instead of being at the bottom of the plate, it's up here. I think it's just a stylistic adaptation is all it is. Now, for a sweep second hand, you can't run your hands off the center wheel. Why? Because the second hand has to come out of the center of the clock. So this design here has an offset gearing arrangement. This is the great wheel. This is the power of the clock into the gear train is applied here. Weight hanging on this drum applies a force. The linear force of gravity is transmitted into a rotational force of this gear. This gear is driving this pinion, and this is your motion work to drive the minute hand, and then this is this idler gear. This drives the hour hand, but through the center of this is tied directly to the arbor of the escape wheel, which would be your sweep second hand. So the design of this movement is a little bit unique. It's nothing that the Millers ever did that I've seen, or Brokaw's. So Tishner figured this out. Now this is an interesting clock. Again, there's one of these very closely related at Yale. A few years back, I can't remember exactly when, at the Claggett exhibit in Newport, the exhibition, one of these. This is a form of mourning art, mourning decoration. It's a transition to the brass style period, because this is black paint on this dial, brass dial, and this is painted decoration, all right? This is Moses Ogden Newark. So this shows you this clock running in the back. So it really does, these clocks really do run. Skeletonized plate movement, even ticks. We have audio-visual video. That's amazing. This didn't work yesterday, by the way. So, thanks, Joe. So behind the opening in the arch is a plate. It's a thin tin plate that's painted. It's also coupled and pivots here at this point, tied directly to the pallet arbor. The clock ticks, the pendulum swings to the right, this plate swings left, the pendulum swings to the left, the plate swings right. And, see, this didn't work yesterday either. Okay, so this is automaton, okay? This is your first example of automaton in the arch, a very interesting period detail. This leads to a lot of things like rocking ships, bobbing Father Time, all kinds of automation and automaton in the arch. And so we look at Mendham. This is a well-known clock. It's written in Drost's book. Doesn't look like this in Drost's book, but that's why we're here, is to restore things, take things that have problems and try to correct them and preserve them back to the original state. If you have a copy of Drost's book, look this clock up and you won't recognize it. But Kelly Kinsel did a wonderful job restoring it, and hats off to him. So in the arch is engraved, made by Levius Dodd for Dr. Ebenezer Blatchley Mendham. This is a very early clock, third quarter of the 18th century. Now, this is why we data mine and harvest and save photos, and we have file folders full of information to go back and compare. It's real clear to me that these two clockmakers either worked in collaboration or were trained by the same person. These are count wheel strike, wood winding drums, but they're nothing like that was made in Elizabethtown. These are clocks that were made. This is Mendham. This is the Ogden in Newark. This one here is missing. You see this? This is to drive your calendar. And you see this one is gone because probably the calendar wouldn't index and stop the clock, so they took the gear off. But you can see that post there. But this has that Z, so-called Z flat brass streak of lightning lift, and this one has it too, a little different shape. But obviously the same inspiration, the same period of time. Here's one you've never heard of, probably never seen. There's only a couple of these around. This is Jeduthan Day. This is Morristown. This is a Queen Anne walnut case with a step top. This is a clock after 1750 and before 1775. All the Miller characteristics you want to find. Clearly trained in Elizabethtown with your wood winding drums, count wheel strike train. Here's your lift arm. Obviously it doesn't have the same quality bell as an Aaron Miller, and it doesn't sound the same, but if you go into Gallery 5, you can see this, and this has a very compact movement with your steel pillar posts holding the movement together. Now, Isaac Brokaw is probably the most prolific clockmaker in New Jersey, probably made thousands of clocks, in honesty, because he worked for such a long period of time. And he's trained by Aaron Miller, and it's a family business, marries Aaron Miller's daughter. And he's working throughout multiple periods, from the Queen Anne, Chippendale, all the way into the painted dial period. This is one of Isaac Brokaw's earliest clocks. You can see a lot of the characteristics with the columns in the bonnet attached to the bonnet door, this arch section here, caddy top, tombstone door. And the movement, obviously, very closely related to work of Aaron Miller, obviously trained in the same shop. And Isaac Brokaw is working in the Chippendale period. This is a very rare and extremely important example in a family of New Jersey cabinet makers that are building full bonnet. What do we mean by full bonnet? Normally you just have scrolls on the bonnet and it's flat in the back. This is like a highboy or a secretary, and the entire depth of the case conforms to this bonnet. You see these floral carved rosettes, very deep petals, flame finial. So this is a true Chippendale clock, probably around the time of the Revolutionary War, just after. You also notice, unlike the previous slide, these columns are detached from the bonnet. So that's your stylistic change. From the side, these very recognizable, indistinguishable from the work of Cornelius Miller or Aaron Miller, and tapered steel pillar posts for the structural integrity, wood winding drums. This always a Brokaw-Miller characteristic is that your bell hammer arbor and extends from the center of the shaft. Many of the clocks have it either at the back or in the front, but not in the center. This one is in Gallery 3. This shows you the connection. And again, it shows you all the different periods and styles that Brokaw is working through. This is a very interesting example because it's signed, dated, and numbered, plus we know who the cabinet maker is. Always a nice thing for collectors to know who actually made the case and not use attributions. This is New Brunswick, New Jersey. This is blind fretwork in the bonnet with fabric behind it, and Edgerton cases were used in a lot of musical movements. So this whole thing with the fretwork and the blind fretwork is to allow the sounds of the striking bells to reflect off the backward and project forward. It's almost like a rear projecting sound system. So they had that knowledge for getting a nice sound quality and building a cabinet that was designed for sound transmission. Also notice how the symmetrical nature of the shape of the top of the waist door and also the base panel. You'll find this design on the doors of linen press, secretaries, etc. Very, very identifiable to Edgerton. And typical movement, not going to bore you with all these count wheel. What I will do is show you the attention. This was made for somebody special because the attention to detail and the engraving on this pendulum, you don't see the pendulum bob. Even clocks that have an oculus, it's very difficult to see the face of the pendulum bob. So there's no reason for this unless this was some special presentation piece. This is IB. The old engraved eyes look like J's. It's not a J, it's an I. And he has two sons, Aaron Brokaw and John Brokaw. John Brokaw is working in the 18th century. This is a walnut Chippendale case, not as sophisticated as the previous one, but nice as well. And this one is a broken arch scrolls over a flat molding, very bold top, and it has the bonus of being one of these full bonnets. Not a lot of these, less than a dozen of these have ever been found. And this is one of them. The movements, indistinguishable from the work of Cornelius Miller, Aaron Miller. You can see this here, this casting imperfection. It didn't matter, okay? It came out of the cast with a hole and it didn't fill properly, no problem. We're just going to use it anyway and put the pillar posts in. Now, around the world, it's a busy world. We're New Jersey centric here, but you know, the China trade in Europe has a very big impact on stylists and furniture, and in particular clock cases. This is the high style London mahogany clock, very popular in the 18th century. Obviously, this is the effect and the impact of the China trade. Now, in North Jersey, There's been adaptations of this case. These are cherry and sweet gum cases, all from Elizabethtown. You don't find a lot of pagoda. This is called the bell top or pagoda top case. You don't find this type of furniture in the Delaware Valley or even in Philadelphia. Very few examples. And the examples in Philadelphia, they're typically Leslie or Leslie and Price, where Robert Leslie actually is running his own clock factory in London and importing the clocks into Philadelphia and selling them as American clocks when they're English. These are Aaron Lane. This is Bonnell. This is Gallery 5. You can see this clock you can't see, or this one, or even that one. But there's a Lane and Sayer that's in Gallery 4 that you can see. And the point is this high style, and by high style, what do we mean? It's a very formal case. It's got vine fretwork on the top. It's got this added piece of fret. These are gilded pine ball-inspired finials with gold leaf. These are brass capitals with brass stop flutes. Okay, these lines, these yellow lines that you see here, those are brass stop flutes. They're here too, but they're not polished. If these were polished, they would be the same color as these brass capitals. Tombstone-shaped waist door with a thumb molding. This is a full applied base panel, not an illusion, step molded base. So, where do we get the idea of step molded base? Well, here's the step molded base design. And here is Ichabod Williams' idea for how to do it in New Jersey. It's very, very popular case style and design in central and northern New Jersey. Very unpopulated, or at least not fabricated in North Jersey. There's another old friend just walked in. Hello. Thanks for coming, Philip. So this is John Brokaw, and this is Isaac Brokaw's son. This is your pagoda or bell top case, engraved brass style. You can see it doesn't have the collars around the winding arbors. Again, the pagoda case. Another one, this is a very early Aaron Lane, and it shows you that Lane must have started out his training in the Miller Brokaw shop, because this movement with a count wheel strike, wood winding drum, etc., again, is indistinguishable from the works of Miller or Lane. It's the only one we've ever found. This is what happens when you refinish a gumwood case. It has no definition. There's no grain structure, very flat. This clock was probably painted at one time, paint decorated, faux grain decorated. This is the more traditional cherry case. This one here by Lane, which signed in the ring, and the reason why is in the arch, there's a strike silent to turn the strike train off at night. And I have a feeling that this is a clock that was sourced, and it was movement itself. Doesn't look New Jersey to me. It looks like it's an English product. It's so, you see how finely finished the front plate is? It doesn't look like something that was locally made. And with this strike silent application, I think they were trying to make a clock that someone wanted an English clock, but they wanted it in cherry, so that's what this is. This is in Gallery 4. This is another full, so I tell you how rare these are, and I've already shown you 5 of these, but okay, but it took 50 years to find 5. So this is Aaron Lane, Elizabethtown. This is a full bonnet Chippendale case, bold proportions, carved rosettes, tombstone-shaped waist door applied panel. And this is engraved. Now, if you notice this, this is a flat brass panel as opposed to the convex name bosses that you see on your earlier clocks. So this is a later feature. This is a clock that's probably somewhere around circa 1790. This is the more traditional Lane movement. This is a locally made movement in New Jersey by Lane, arch plate movement. You can see that the plate is, these plates are not finely finished at all. This is local castings. This is your rack and snail movement. And again, we have brass shell winding drums on this and not wood. And this is the motion work to drive the calendar. This is the furniture detail that I've been telling you about, this full bonnet construction. This one has, instead of carved floral rosettes, this has inset carved rosettes. This is another Lane. This is a case by Ichabod Williams, who's his brother-in-law, silver brass style. This is a mahogany case. Obviously, there's no mahogany trees in Elizabethtown. This shows you the trade that went on. A lot of commerce with the West Indies where mahogany would come up in exchange for farm goods, if you read the old newspapers. This is the movement. Look at the high copper content, that red brass. The red brass is much stronger. They knew that at that time. And so when they cast these plates, that was the intent. This is another one. This one has the cabinet. I have pictures of the cabinet maker's label on this. This is made and sold by Ichabod Williams, cabinet maker. This one, and you can see, obviously, that he had an order for this thing, and he was trying to produce a version of a locally crafted case that had the features of the high-style London. You can also see the way these floral rosettes are tipping down. If you go look at the Silas Howell, there's a musical clock in a labeled Edgerton case in Gallery 3 by Silas Howell, Matthew Edgerton. These same rosettes, and they're tipping down like this. That is a style of the day. You can't say that's Ichabod Williams, but you can say that this is a period detail of this particular, you're looking at somewhere around 1790, and that's what was important. You can obviously see here, this with these scribe marks, you see the layout of the train. This is the gear train, these circles. These plates were designed and laid out before they were drilled. This is another lane, very similar. The case on this is similar to the case housing the Brokaw movement. There's two Brokaw movements in Edgerton cases in Gallery 3. You take a good look at them. This has a handwritten label, Matthew Edgerton Jr. In New Brunswick, the label and the signature, et cetera, is nearly identical to the one in the Newark Museum. I can tell you that because I took it out of the showcase about 3 months ago and took some good pictures of it. This is a clock from the president's office in Brown University, Lane and Jack. Jack is something that has never been positively identified. We assume it's John Jack, who was a clockmaker in New York City. So this partnership, Lane was in and out of business with a lot of people, Lane and Sayer, for example. So this is Boundbrook. The thing about this is the tiger maple case. It's a striking, wonderful piece of furniture. Tiger maple is just unlike any other wood. Even the people that love mahogany, I'd rather have a tiger maple case than a mahogany case myself. So that's the good news. The bad news is some clockmaker, let's say within the last few decades, based on the president, I shouldn't say this, they could kill me. The president didn't want to hear the sound of the striking. So what they do? They took out all the striking and the musical. See, there's 3 winding holes, 1, 2, 3. This one was our musical clock, that no more. But we have one, I can tell you what it probably was. It was probably something like this. This is Jacob Bunnell. This is in Gallery 5. This is silver brass style. This is a mahogany case, and it's an attempt for the London style, but not so sophisticated. It does have the thumb molding around the waist door. It does have the thumb molding around the base panel, and it is a wonderful example with original feet by Ichabod Williams, and it has the musical train intact. Well, it's been restored, I can tell you that. And it plays marionettes on 8 bells. And if we walk over, anybody wants to, we'll make sure you hear what this sounds like, because it's quite nice. It's a very compact movement because, again, these early brass style musical movements, the pin drum has to fit between the plates. The later movements extend out, and they can be tune selectable with cams and different play different songs. So we get into painted dial, Chippendale. The Chippendale period is basically starts in the last quarter of the 18th century. We have the same 2 craft centers, just with different villains at the work, because we're looking at the 2nd and 3rd generation clockmakers by the time the painted dial comes into play. And we also have to highlight, which you'll see if you haven't been to the gallery, at the top of the staircase, not the first landing, but at the very top of the staircase is a clock by Peter Hill. Peter Hill was an apprentice to Joseph Hollinshead Jr., and he was given his freedom, and he made about 100 clocks or so. This is John Hollinshead. He's the son of Joseph Hollinshead Sr. This particular clock shows a transfer. This is a woodcut stamp on the dial with Father Time below Burlington. It's a typical 8-day brass movement, rack and snail strike train. It's beautiful Delaware Valley case, very bold proportions, bold scrolls, and bold carved rosettes, typical of what you find in Delaware Valley. Not as sophisticated as across the river in Philadelphia, but for South Jersey, this is as nice a case as you'll find. So Peter Hill is very fortunate that we were able to get this. This is a clock I've known about for a long time. As a matter of fact, the original owner of this clock, I had a chance to chat with him at the opening. I hadn't spoken to him in 40 years. But long story short, look at this. This is the strike lock mechanism, tailless gathering pallet. This is so-called strike rack lock. So there's no pin here, and there's no flag or tail on the gathering pallet. This is the clock in the Smithsonian, and this is the clock upstairs. We're very fortunate to have this case and have this clock and be able to have it in a public exhibition. There's not many of these. You never see them. They never turn over. They're never for sale. And so to have that here, it's a really great thing. And you can thank the research people. The research people here on this staff did a fantastic job finding a lot of these clocks and then twisting the arms of the owners to allow us to borrow them for a year. Because, you know, if you own a clock like this, do you want to send this out for a year? But one thing is very similar. We have number 29 upstairs. Number 30 is in the Smithsonian. And look at the dial decoration. Look at the floral decoration in the spandrels, and look at the arch. Okay? These dials were probably bought at the same time. These are English imported painted iron dials, Osborne Manufacturing. This is the painted iron dial, also English. This is William Hudson, Mount Holly. This is a wonderful case. It's a fabulous Chippendale case with very bold. If you like this stuff, it's very heavy. There's the German, Pennsylvania German influence. The cabinet maker here is Joseph Brumley. This is William Hudson, Mount Holly. This is a clock circa 1798 to 1800. This is the movement. It shows you the difference between a couple of clocks. And this will show you the brass dial period of Hudson. And this is the painted dial. One thing you see, the earlier clock has a strike rack locking, and the later clock has a gathering pallet with a tail and a pin. You can see it better here. At the end of the strike, the snail drops and locks the rack in place so it stops chiming. Over here, this has a gathering pallet with an internal tail that spins, and the post is on the inside, so it's an inside. And when this spins and hits this pin on the rack, it stops striking. Same maker. Clocks are 20 years apart. And here you go, one more time. This is the brass dial. This is the rack that's locked in place, and here, the gathering pallet with the tail and the pin and the strike. These little things help you identify a clock that's unsigned. Now, stylistic changes, okay? This one's later than this, right? You can see the well-defined center of the flower, the pistil, with all this carving and decoration, deep leaf carving, and this one doesn't have it. 20 years difference. So it's less craftsmanship here than here. Same cabinet maker. So Morgan Hollinshead, we've had a couple of them over the years. There's number 76 that you'll find in the second gallery. It's a wonderful clock. This was number 95 that's very happy in Moorestown right now. Hollinshead is a clockmaker that's working. He's really a later clockmaker. He's not making brass dial clocks. He's making painted dial clocks. This particular case is made by Jeremiah Haynes. And the way I can tell you that is the construction. These are the original feet on this clock, very delicate original feet. It's got the original bottom board. A lot of clocks, they're not maintained properly. Either the pulleys break or the cables unwind, the weight goes through the bottom, it breaks out the base, takes the feet. And so a lot of clocks don't have the original feet. These do. And how do I know that? Well, you turn this over on its back, as it turns out, we have a couple of chests. You know, if you're going to collect clocks, you're going to own the furniture too, right? The people that came through from the Wadsworth Athenaeum and their consultant, Gary Sullivan, they had planned to do an exhibit on Connecticut clocks. It didn't come to fruition, but what they were going to do was to have documented case furniture alongside the clock cases so you could see how the attribution. And the attribution I'm making, you got to take my word for it, but the fluting and the construction of the quarter columns matches two signed and dated chests of drawers, and so does this foot. So this is the dial on the Hollinshead, Morgan Hollinshead, number 76. You can see the armillary sphere. up in the arch, paying reverence or significance to the position in the world and the planets and the system. And this is what's called a transfer dial. So this is not a painted dial in the true sense of hand painting. These spandrels are formed with woodcut patterns, and this is a transfer as well. So these early painted iron dials are actually not hand painted. And this particular clock has the other interesting feature that it has an American bell in it, John Wilbank Castor. Now, one of the things about it, Wilbank is working later. This bell is later than the clock, but it could be that the style of the day the clock had to be serviced. Hey, you want a Wilbank bell? Wilbank's a very famous craftsman in Philadelphia. Do you want a Wilbank bell when we return your clock? Oh, okay, here you go. But this is not of the same period as this. This is the Hollinshead number 95. Again, these are very generic movements by now, and they're commodity movements. This is number 95. You'll see this all through the Delaware Valley, 8-day brass movement, rack and stale striking mechanism. And this one has a calendar. The calendar is indexed. You see this cam. This on the center, hour cannon, this little piece right here, that indexes and pushes on that wheel. Isaac Brokaw, same period in time, but an hour or so north. We go up into Elizabethtown. This is what the style is now. It's a little bit different. First thing you notice, the proportions of this are different. This has a recessed panel base, tombstone-shaped door, same kind of dial. These are English dials, Osborne manufacturing. One thing you notice right away, this does not have the moon, and this one does. The one with the moon dial has less space between the top of the crown molding and here. So the dimensions of these cases side by side is identical. However, the construction of the faceboard of this bonnet here, the arch section here, had to accommodate the arch of the moon, and this one doesn't. Now, the carving here of these rosettes is phenomenal. This dental molded crown molding, dental molded scrolls, all this inset, basically a floral carving, and urn and flame finial. It's a cherry Chippendale case. You're looking at circa 1785 to 1790. The movements have to be a little different, and the reason why is that in order to drive this moon wheel, we need a gear, we need a wheel. And so this motion work, and it's 2 gears, by the way. This is the idler gear to activate the strike. It has a second gear with a wheel and a pin. The moon is activated here. Okay? But you can see the movements are the same. So this is Isaac Brokaw. In New Brunswick, Leslie and Williams, you can see the influence here. There's scrolls over a flat molding with dental. Obviously, that's the style of the day. The other thing is, look at the conforming shape of the waist door and the base panel. Again, if you collect New Jersey furniture, you might have a desk or a linen press that has this same treatment on the doors. It's an English dial. It's also a transfer dial made with woodcuts. The Leslie and Williams New Brunswick movement, it's a rack and snail striking movement. This one with arch plates, you can see. Well, one interesting thing is they probably designed this thing wrong, because they had to make this basically to create clearance between, this is the second, your second hand would go on here. But to activate the strike, they had to create this crazy structure, whereas they could have moved the whole thing up and avoided that with the right angle coming this way. But I didn't make it. This is a wonderful Leslie and Williams musical clock, 3-train New Brunswick case, documented, a little known maker, but still known, Joseph Ward. Up in the arch, you select, and this basically indexes, and this moves the position of the drum in and out so that the hammers can hit different parts on the pin barrel. This slides, and this shows you why so many musical clocks have been disabled over the years, because this pin barrel has a wooden core. This core changes dimensionally, shrinkage and cracking, and it loses its shape. And the next thing you know, the pins break, the hammers break, it loses its shape, the eccentricity of the barrel changes. But long story short, there's a clutch. This barrel slides back and forth. This is the retention. And different bells, as this slides, different parts of the drum activate these different hammers. This is a tune selectable musical. Wonderful clock. And the Federal period, same craft centers. The only difference now is the proportions as the case become much more delicate, much more elaborate. The use and focus on inlays and wood selection. We also see the introduction of locally painted American dials with Boston influence from Boston artisans. And starting the south again and work our way north. This is a Federal clock by Joseph Budd, New Mills. This is Pemberton, New Jersey. On the inside of the door, some chalk. Look for the chalk. This is William Wilson. He was a Philadelphia repairman, 1823. Down here is Joseph Johnson of Hightstown. And, you know, by the end of the talk, I'll figure out how to use this. And very nicely made, 8-day brass, rack and snail striking mechanism. Here is the motion work to drive the moon. Case is actually very sophisticated. There's a lot of nice details in the rosettes and also the center plinth. And this has an illusion base on it. This is not an applied base panel. It's just a molding that makes it look like a base panel. So when you're standing back, it looks like that. So one of the things you don't find in New Jersey are one-day clocks. Very common in Pennsylvania. It's a Pennsylvania German thing. You go across the river in Bucks, Berks, Montgomery, Lehigh counties, all these counties, they're filled with one-day clocks. New Jersey, not so much. Just a few have been found. They're extremely rare, and they must not have been popular, otherwise there'd be more now. What makes this interesting, well, first of all, this is the case that it's in. The case is not here. But the movement's on the test stand, and hopefully it's running. And what's interesting about it is they found a way with a single weight and a continuous chain to power the time and the strike in parallel with one weight. Of course, you have to pull the chain every day, and this is George Hetzel of Princeton. So this is a locally made clock, and it's interesting to include because it completes the story. This is a Federal period clock from South Jersey. This is Edward Hudson, Mount Holly. And you can see by the time we get the later clocks, the bonnets have lost their definition. They're not powerful, they're not bold, the scrolls have thinned out. And the cases have become fairly generic. This is a dial sourced in Philadelphia. This is a Patton & Jones Philadelphia American painted iron dial. It's lost a lot of its gilding, but one of the things that will tell you it's an American dial are these gilded internal time track and exterior gilding around the end. A lot of these, the fancy ones, this is like a B dial. The A- dial has got raised gilt gesso bead decoration all around the border. And this is Hudson's movement, typical Delaware Valley movement, 8-day brass striking movement. And look at this deep. When you see this big deep notch here, you know that you've got strike rack locking. Very characteristic. George Holland said he's working in Woodstown. This is a case. This is a commodity by now. First quarter of 19th century, toward the end, we have clocks that are being basically sourced. Dials, movements, the whole thing. The case is locally made. It's a local Delaware Valley case with local walnut, yellow pine backboard. And, but this one is an English movement. This Ainsworth Warrington, this is George Ainsworth Warrington. If you have a clock from the Delaware Valley, there's a good chance the bell on your clock says G period Ainsworth, W-A-R-R period. This is another Holland said. This came from the Decoux family. And this one also has a nice Voorhees. So we know this was cleaned in 1830. So this clock's got to be a little before 1830. It's first quarter, 19th century, toward the end, 1820s. It's got the ship, but doesn't have an American flag. It is an American painted iron dial, though. George Holland said. American painted iron dial, very thin sheet steel false plate. The English false plates are cast and they're very thick. One of the ways you can tell this is an American dial is from the false plate. This is Trenton, William Leslie Trenton in a Josiah Fithian case. This is also a tune selectable musical. And again, the drum extends out the back of the plate. So this movement here needs a deeper case to support this rack of bells and this drum that extends out the back of the case. This is three-train musical. This is as nice a clock as you're going to find made in New Jersey. And you're looking at a clock somewhere. Because it's Leslie and Trenton, most likely it's around 1805, I would say, maybe 1810. This is the Howell clock that we were fortunate to borrow. This is in Gallery 3. Remember the comment I had about the rosettes tipping down, the florals. Inside you will find several things about this clock. It's 3-train musical. It's signed, it's dated 1797, and it's got the cabinetmakers label inside. Fabulous Chippendale case, fabulous Federal case with Corinthian columns. This is the most elaborate decorative treatment for the capitals, and Corinthian capitals in the bonnet, this blind fretwork in the top, and look at the bellflower inlay down the sides. The Edgerton cases are known for having fluted columns in the waist and chamfered corners in the base. So in Trenton, this is like a quick snapshot of what you'll find from country to formal. This clock is in Gallery 3, and this is William J. Leslie Trenton. You can see the same hand made this, and this one's got a little more going on in the frieze panel here. But these two cases are both by Josiah Fithian Trenton. More country case. The thing here is in the wood selection is a curly cherry case, and you can see the striping in the door, very effective treatment. And this 2-panel theme here, Trenton as well, William J. Leslie Trenton with the compass stars up on the top, and also floral rosettes. So Elizabethtown is much more sophisticated cases. They're narrower waist. The first thing you notice is narrow waist. This is John Scudder. This is Ichabod Williams. This is Oliver Parcell. This is John Scudder as well. These are all Brokaw clocks. Aaron Brokaw, this is in Gallery 4. John Brokaw, it's not here, but you can see it's got the demi-lune fan inlay, quarter fan inlay in the bottom door, step base. Very high, delicate scrolls. These open circles in the scrolls point to northern New Jersey, not southern New Jersey, and the delicate treatment as compared to what you find in New Brunswick with much heavier scrolls. This one's also in Gallery 3. And this one, I don't know where this is. I think this one's in Bernardsville right now. This is the Governor of Room case. And this is Richard Hooley. This is a wonderful, you know, the old days, you know, we're lucky to have Polaroids. This is what happens when you take a Polaroid picture. The clock was so nice. This is an old picture with fluorescent lighting, but I had to show you. This is another Fithian case. And look at the vine and berry carving. Inlay in the bonnet. And these flame panels, 2-panel theme. Wonderful clock. This is Isaac Brokaw, Bridgetown, Rahway. All the way through into the 19th century, for 60 years, Isaac Brokaw is making clocks the same way. It's a little bit later clock because he's got brass shells over his wood winding drums. But you can see with this arrow here, there's the count wheel. And all this motion work. Why all these extra, look at all of this. This drives the calendar hand and 2 sets of gears to drive the calendar hand. Why? Because this dial was painted with reverse direction, counterclockwise. So most calendars index clockwise. This particular calendar indexes from 1 to 31 counterclockwise. So they had to add this motion work to do that. No reason for it, just a waste of money. But the dial was probably in stock. Okay, you want this clock, you want this dial, this is what I have. Okay, I'll take it. I'll figure out how to make the calendar work. This is Leslie and Williams, New Brunswick. This is a wonderful case, quarter fan inlay. This is in Gallery 3. Look at this step base, okay? And the quarter fan inlay in the base, quarter fan inlay at the bottom of the door. This double peak design is something you find in central New Jersey. Look at the book inlay. They call this book inlay. There's 3 patterns of inlay. Book inlay in the top, very high open scrolls. And this is the movement. Again, it's got this copper color to it, very high copper content, arch plates, very typical central New Jersey movement. This one is also in Gallery 4. Someone had commented, I thought there were no unsigned clocks here. There's no name on the dial. Well, not every clock is signed on the dial. There's clocks that are signed on the movement. This one happens to be signed on the pendulum. And it's dated 1812, James Davis Bluefield, number 5. So we know there's at least 4 more of these. Very high style case. And this one here has what's called the Irish panel. So this door below has a panel. This is line inlay. You can't see it. It's a very dark old finish. Book inlay here, inlaid, book inlay here. inlaid swan's neck pediment, inlaid rosettes in the top. American painted iron dial, which I'll show you in a second. This is a count wheel movement, only this one has an interesting deviation to it. So instead of having a plate or a wheel with notches in it, they put pins. And so these pins are spaced, right? As you can see how tight they are here. That would be 1 and 2 o'clock, and out here would be like 12 o'clock. So the spacing of the pins controls the timing and a number of strikes. And this one also has another complication where with just one, usually you need 2 arms for the strike warning and a strike arrest. And Davis figured out a way with this single strike lift to not only have accomplished the strike warning, but the strike itself. So you're looking at 1812 Bloomfield. We skipped over something. No, I guess we didn't. So this is not the clock on the staircase, the Frelinghuysen family clock, but one just like it. Unsigned clock with an Isaac Brokaw movement in it. Inside the door, pasted to the backboard, is a cabinetmaker's label, made and sold by John Scudder. So by the early 19th century, Scudder is leaving Westfield, like a lot of New Jersey craftsmen, the Western Reserve, and opening of the West, and he settles in Cincinnati, where he's making clocks in Cincinnati that look like New Jersey clocks. This is Uriah Gould Mendham. You can see the impact here of the timing on this around the time of the War of 1812. This is a form of military decoration. And, really? Okay, yeah, I know. So, long story short, this is an 8-day brass striking movement. This is a case by Topping. And you can see it's got crossbanding in the base. It's got this oval inset in the bottom. And this red, white, and blue shield decoration tells you the period of the construction. This is Hooley in Flemington, not the Hooley that's in the gallery, but one just as nice. Again, this is country, high country. We don't have satinwood inlay and a lot of pattern inlay, but we do have crotch inset panels, crotch panel here, and nice broken arch scroll. This is an American painted iron dial. You don't need to look at the back and see that this is Spencer Nolan from Boston. You can look at the front and you know that when you see these vibrant colors, this blood red, Kelly green, and mustard yellow, that you're looking at an American painted iron dial. And with this gilding, with the inner and outer gilded time tracks, that tells you this is an American dial. This is the Hooley movement. I got to really move fast because I'm getting the hook. And this is a Hill clock. This is from Flemington. Not the clock in the gallery, but one more typical. The clock in the gallery is much more refined than this with satinwood and string inlay. This one is like the Hooley. It's got these inset panels, this so-called half door with the Irish panel below. This is country. This is what we have in the country. Beautiful original signature. Joachim Hill, Flemington. Hill clocks don't use false plates. There's American iron dials mount directly to the front plate. If you see a Hill clock that doesn't have a moon or uses a false plate, take another hard look at it before you buy it. This is another American dial. This is Willard and Nolan dial, Boston. And this shows you that treatment I was telling you with this gilt gesso bead decoration all around the outer time track. When you see these rayed gilt balls all around the time track, it's a real good indication that it is American dial. Into the early 19th century, Brokaw's changed from block lettered sign dials into script sign dials. So the Isaac Brokaw's and the Aaron Brokaw Bridgetown clocks after 1820 typically have script signatures. The movements haven't changed much with the exception of now having brass shell. On the drums still have arch plates, still have count wheel strike, don't have steel pillars anymore, using brass pillars. You can see up here faintly, this is Nolan's Manufactory on the back of a thin iron false plate. It's a Boston dial. Moses Styles, this is in Gallery 4 as well. This is a wonderful country federal case with compass star inlay and rosettes. You have the demi-lune starburst inlay above the waist door. You have herringbone inlay in the base panel and OG bracket feet. Gilt balls, you see this again? It's American dial, Thomas Williams Flemington. Got to move fast. Nolan's Manufactory, Spencer Nolan, who worked with Aaron Willard Jr. in Boston. George Ray, this is the clock from Princeton is in Gallery 3. This is the more country clock. Ray worked in a lot of places. He's advertised in Trenton, Quakertown, Princeton, Flemington. This is the more country cherry transitional case. It's dated 1797. The Princeton clock in Gallery 3 is more like around 1810, 1815. You can see the difference between the two movements between Quakertown and Princeton. Very, very similar construction. They're both rack and snail. The only difference is the Quakertown movement has a lunar phase dial, and the Ray clock drive for the lunar phase dial doesn't use a gear. It's using this cam right here to lift an L-shaped lever behind the dial. So it simplifies. Basically, he reduced the number of gears and reduced this and added this instead. In North Jersey, we have Schumacher. In Patterson, Ryerson, in Pompton, and the Newark-Pompton area clocks have wider proportions. You can see this wider footprint, and you can see the scroll moldings that don't have open circles at the top. This particular one dates from around the War of 1812. Why? Look at this. This is a form of military decoration, the American Eagle and Stars decoration. This is Isaac Schumacher from Patterson. And one of the things, as we get into the later clocks, we see some technical innovation. The innovation here is this point right here. This is called maintaining power. On the inside of the great wheel that powers the clock is a secondary gear that's held here. This puts power on the movement. It allows the clock to keep ticking while you wind it. It's called maintaining power. It's a nice development. This is Hackensack, William Dawes, count wheel strike train. Beautiful shell. These northern New Jersey clocks have these multiple panel themes. I've seen them with shells, I've seen them with fans, I've seen them with eagles, and these multiple themes and the multiple panels. This is William Dawes. So the dials, it's not what you see in the front. Look in the back. A lot of these dials have labels, maker's labels in the back. This is Curtis Manufactory. That's Samuel Curtis from Boston for Patton & Jones, Philadelphia. By the time we're into the federal period in the early 19th century, we're using our own dials. This is military painting around the War of 1812. You see the American flag flying on the ship. And this raised gilt gesso and bead decoration with these vibrant red, Kelly green, etc., mustard yellow, that's an American dial. Another American dial, American flag, raised gilt gesso and bead decoration. See this bead decoration? Nolan, look on the back of the dial, take the false plate off. These are different clocks. This one's on the back of the dial itself. This is on the false plate, very thin, flat false plate, signed Nolan, and at the bottom it'll say Boston. Another American dial, Samuel Curtis. This is on the clock by James Davis of Bloomfield, American flag. Another Spencer Nolan. I know, you're tired. So we get out of the first quarter of the federal period. This is the end, I promise. And I could go on for another 2 hours. But long story short, the clocks have lost their proportions, their shape, and now we find these very heavy, massive carved paw feet. We see these spiral turned columns with carvings that almost look like table legs. They more or less look like tall case clocks, but from an aesthetic standpoint, they really don't have a lot in common with the previous style. It just shows you it's nothing different than now. Every decade or so, styles change dramatically. Go back and look at photos from 10 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. This is a clock from about 1835, this is Gustavus Auden, New Brunswick, made the movement. It's a labeled James Moore, New Brunswick cabinet case. And these are the features you find. Spiral turn feet, basically freestanding full turn columns. In South Jersey, down in Haddonfield, Whitehead is one of the last makers at work, again with these spiral columns. And this belonged to Cy Fellheimer. And an exhibition catalog is at the printer right now. And in about a week, it'll be available. I don't have any. I can only tell you that the museum will have some soon. And you can look online or contact whoever she tells you to contact to get one. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and also thank the people at this museum, because the number of people worked tirelessly over a period of many weeks and many hours putting this together. If you saw what was here before, the bell, and as I can speak to this because I'm an electrical engineer, if you saw the rat's nest of wire and hardware that were in these galleries 6 weeks ago and what's there now, it's an amazing transformation. The people here did an unbelievable job turning this into what might be the nicest cold case clock exhibit that's ever been presented. Thank you. Thanks for coming, John.